But I think these axes are shaping women's responses to the state. I think as the idea of the state was contested earlier, it may not have had the kind of social legitimacy to assert this monopoly on violence, so it kind of democratized it by creating these enclaves of impunity. So at one level we can see Farida as an enclave of impunity where the tribal norms could dictate, you know, even if it was like you can go and, you know, fire a gun outside a woman's house and then from that point no one ever can propose to her again. Or it's domestic violence, whatever it was. So I think if there were these enclaves of impunity that we are seeing a revocation of, the state has started to gain consensus and started to challenge men's impunity in the private sphere, and I think that's changing the social contract itself. And that's, I think, why there's such a strong reaction to domestic violence laws. On the social contract front, if I go further, something remotely amusing, and that is that there's a bizarre episode, because we were talking about the tribal areas, there's a bizarre episode in North Waziristan and Farida, where the army made the return of North Waziristan displaced people to their homes, conditional on signing a code of conduct, through which tribes had to affirm their loyalty to Pakistan and recognize in writing that it was their fault that there was a proliferation of insurgents in their areas. And if they wanted to go back home, they had to pledge that they will not allow the use of their land for terrorism, and if they did, the government was free to conduct any operation and destroy their houses. And they would then therefore not be able to ask for compensation. They would lose their right to compensation too. But what's interesting about this is this code of conduct is officially called the social contract. So this is the social contract that's signed between the armed forces and the army in particular and tribesmen. And ridiculous though the covenant is, no one still asked the women to sign it. So I just want to say, well, at one level, you know, when I keep talking about the state, I think I'm using it as a shortcut to lumping together the state and the government, which I know are of course very distinct, but the reason I do lump them together is because the women that I speak with or I work with don't speak of the state at all. They don't even speak of the government, they speak of this thing called Nizam, which I think they refer to a structural order and a structuring order that is a composite of the state and government and much else also. I think the nature of the state is changing, women's lived realities are changing, and women's relationship with the state then is also changing. I think it's too soon probably to say what it's changing into. The center-periphery paradigm, if it's to be understood as being in the middle of power or distance from power, I don't think it makes sense anymore to understand it just geographically. You know, for instance, the army right now is just deployed in 2 places in the tribal area. So then do we say that Waziristan is the center of power in Pakistan? We don't. So I think that there's more than one way of reading this. And the centrality of the state to women's political consciousness and mobilization shows that the Pakistani nation state is a field of contestation where different groups vie for claim over the nation state. The citizenship is obviously, seems to me, not a level playing field, but more of a continuum, where women are positioned in the peripheries, but now the placement is in the flux. So we see this movements happening. Women's mobility is also derived from symbolic capital from other fields, whether it's class, ethnicity, location, profession, livelihood, and all other intersections of power, to change their position within the field of the nation state. And I think it's this continuum of citizenship that can explain to us the seismic shifts of power underway and women's relationship with the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very rich paper outlining a series of paradoxes in the understanding of the state by the women's movement. And I can actually see very interesting points of comparison and contrast with India. But our discussant, Farida, will, I think, have something more to say. Thank you very much for taking the time, Nazish.
Thank you. I love reading Nazish's work because it's always thought-provoking and it is often points you in different directions. So thank you, Nazish, even if it's not a full paper. I completely agree with you that the citizenship is never a level playing field. But I'm not sure I like the word continuum. I've discussed this for a long time with Nira Yuval Davis, who uses the term layered citizenship. I don't like layer because it suggests something very neat. I don't think citizenship is neat at all. So let me just say a few things about that. All nation states, in my opinion, have always got a gold standard, stellar. Who is the citizen? And in that sense, if we look at Pakistan, I think that citizen, and it's not just here and in post-colonial states, it's everywhere. It's a man, obviously, Punjabi, Muslim, etc., and you can continue. That is the standard against which the citizens are measured, the others. The others, of course, have to negotiate and mediate and fight to be recognized by the state, and of course that includes women, but it's not just women. So there is that myth here in terms of, there's a myth in the nation state, is that there is nothing between the state and its citizens except state institutions, mechanisms, systems. That's completely false. And it's always been false. And it's especially false in post-colonial states, but it's already existed before. If we look at what Weber's state monopoly, and I think that's a good point, I agree that the state is expanding its presence. But the state monopoly over violence has always stopped at the threshold of the household. Anyway, look at the constitutions and what they say. So many constitutions, including Pakistan's, protect the family. So in that sense, the nation state has always delegated its monopoly to the patriarch once you hit that family thing. Secondly, in terms of, I guess, the post-colonial states, I think we have a problem because I like the imagery of center-periphery as, movement. However, I'm not sure that the straight colonial discourse can be shifted here. Can I also just, I have notes everywhere, the non-stellar people, let me just point out, this is not just post-colonial states. If you look at the UK, which is one of the oldest nation states with a democracy that functions, when it comes to minorities, however, the democratic process of elected representatives is cast aside, and the spokespersons for those communities are a few, usually older men, often with religious sort of labels or authority. So if you look at Geeta Sehgal's work, she talks precisely about this. If you look at the case of India, Zoya Hassan says something quite similar. How does the state interact with citizens? How does it interact with particular groups of citizens is actually quite different. Of course, for states like Pakistan, we came about when there was no other possibility for statehood and getting rid of colonial except the nation state, which was the international world order. But most of us emerged as state nations, not as nation states. Nation states emerged out of centuries of killing each other in Europe. There was a nation. We became states and then started looking for a nation. And I think in the process of having that statehood, the peripheries, what I understand by your calling peripheries, were crucial to the negotiation of that state. So it wasn't that there were peripheries, and they actually occupy your state central, if we're looking at the state as a central thing, they actually occupy it. It's the same people sitting there. Look at the elected representatives. The elected representatives are your landlords, your feudals, your various heads of tribes, etc. They have actually appropriated the state apparatus in order to reassert their power in their localities in the peripheries. But I agree things are changing. The colonial state itself never got involved. It imposed laws but didn't get involved in gender. So I'm going to jump now to gender because I don't have that much. And not gender so much as the women's movement. So also after the inaugural discussion, I'm just wondering, when we talk about women's movement, who are we talking about? When you talk about the articulation and the conscientization being really driven by the state and its presence or absence, I wonder if that's true. The mobilization perhaps in what is recognized as the women's movement, and I'm glad you just said that calls itself the women's movement. Yes, maybe mobilized, but conscientized, I doubt it. I think more women take actions because of non-state actors than they ever do because of state actors. The redress yes, that's when we talk about the redressal is usually about the state. But for me, this is really a question of women are so isolated, and this is quite deliberate, I think, that the isolation in which women live on their private level, and as you're saying, women from one area versus the others, the disarticulation of the state and connections means that we are also not very connected. And one of the questions I ask myself is whether it's really power proximities that we're looking at in terms of how women respond. There are many non-documented, non-acknowledged forms in which women are protesting, usually over violence, usually with the men in their immediate communities. Women have actually tried to get onto jirgas. They have succeeded in getting onto jirgas. They have tried, it doesn't work, but you know, there has been attempts, so it's not that they haven't, we haven't really documented them very well. In terms of your BSIP card and that woman saying, I'm here, I exist, let me give you an alternative. We have women who call themselves purple women, Jamni Orthe. Jamni Orthe are community women, they've become activated, but they enter the police station with their chadars. They all wear purple chadars. And that is the identity. So they recognize the state, but they are not using a state-given card, but they do have a subjectivity as now being citizens, and that the state can be a counter to the power in which they are caught up. In Swat, women were mobilized by Fazlullah. They did become active. He kind of bypassed the family patriarch to assert himself, you know, through the radio, through a medium, into their households, and invited them to rebel, and they did rebel. It's not that they didn't rebel. They rebelled against their in-laws, they rebelled against their husbands, they stood up and demanded rights. So I will go back to my question of what is the movement? What qualifies as being gender-bender behavior? And is it all towards a feminist movement, or do we talk about something else? So I'm just wondering whether we need to talk about movements or feminist change-making. And then we'd have to go back to the question of what is feminist versus other things. Let me end with just some random questions that I think we all need to be thinking about. One of the things that, if we are talking about center periphery, that I think you might want to look at, is there then a center and periphery of the women's movement? Right? So who do we consider the center? What is driving it? And how does it all articulate into each other and connect into each other? And of course the state is responding and bringing its power and monopoly over violence into the domestic. By the way, there's only 2 domestic violence laws. Punjab doesn't have it, it's not criminalizing the act. But WAF, Women's Action Forum, has always debated, how much do you want the state to come into your private sphere? And I think that's a tension everywhere, that you want some things, but you don't want the state to be actually coming in unnecessarily. One of the learnings for me has been recently, it's an old learning, is that you really need to construct while you deconstruct. And I see very few examples of women actually reconstructing a different reality while you're trying to deconstruct and attack, challenge, change the patriarchal systems and structures that exist. And I think that is what I've said for a long time, is that we all seem to know what we don't want. We're very poor at saying what it is that we want. We don't like the nation state, it's misogynist, blah, blah, blah. What do we want in its place? We don't like the marketplace, we don't like globalization, globalized market operations. What are we proposing in its place as feminists? And I think that's an agenda that we haven't done. In terms of actually recreating something, the only example that I've recently heard about, which I am absolutely completely impressed by, is the Kurdish women's movement in Kobani. And they really are trying to work through, in very different circumstances, what does self-determination mean outside the parameters of a nation state? What does it mean to have an economy that is ecologically sound and is not capitalist in nature? What does it mean to have a government where women are really equal partners in that governance structure, because they have a dual thing. So you always have a woman there, plus they have separate courts for violence against women run by women, in addition to the normal courts. There are various interesting things that they're doing, but it's the only example. And then I ask myself, is it because they are isolated? And because they're not part of the wider, because they are in fact isolated, they're facing a lot of problems, but that means also that they're isolated from the other dynamics. So as I said, lots of questions, and thank you for its wonderful ideas.
Thank you very much, Farida, for opening up the presentation in such really intriguing and very, very thought-provoking ways. We will have 20 minutes for questions if we are to close for lunch even 15 minutes later than scheduled. So we take the first round of questions now. 1, 2 at the back.